So, the future of warfare, the future of strategy, the future, therefore, of technology. I'm not really sure if I expect this to do well. This is one of those video topics which can do one of two things. It'll either do disturbingly well, and I'll never be able to replicate it or work out why it did well, so I'll always be sitting there going, or it will die a small death in the logarithm. I have a feeling I know which one it will do, because in my experience, more esoteric topics tend to die a death in the logarithm, despite I think they have relevance and are useful. This topic's also interesting for me because, unlike when I'm doing pretty much any other topic on this channel, this is closest to what I sometimes teach in terms of theory of warfare and theory of strategy. But it's also the least factually connected. This is something I learned a long time ago when I was first teaching, war studies and first teaching those things. Was that you have a lot of stepping stones. Let's say if I show some of the books quickly. Luckily I've got a nice white wall behind me to show up books on, so that shows up quite nicely in the things. Why is that finger doing that? I have no idea. Yeah. We have that, Britain's Naval Future by James Cable. We of course also have Gillian Corbett, Some Principles of Maritime Strategy, which are in the whole chapter. But you also, worthwhile thinking about Theodore Roosevelt's Naval Diplomacy. We have Mahan. Please note, this isn't his first book. This is the Interest of American Sea Power. Present and Future. Some papers put together of his. And we have my favourite. Honestly, I'm not a theorist. I'm just a historian. Andrew Lambert. By the way, if you want to look at a great work about juggling transitionary periods and juggling what you need to buy in a transitionary period with what you might end up needing to buy and how quickly ships can become irrelevant in a transitionary period and how you build them so they don't necessarily become irrelevant. Great book. So, what are we talking about? What are we talking about when we start talking about this subject? Why am I saying it's the least connected? Because when I'm talking about the past, there is a timeline, there are notes, there are historical records, there are hard pieces of archaeology, there are hard pieces of evidence, physical objects I can point to, I can touch, I can demonstrate with. When I'm talking about the present, I can show videos of, especially paper and news broadcasts, and I can talk things through, and I can look at the various accounts which are coming out, and I can use those as reference points. So it's not going to necessarily be as accurate as a proper historical interpretation when you've got all the information, you're able to put it all alongside, but you can do something. You can do something. But when you're talking about the future, you are talking about things a long way beyond what we're talking about now. Why? Because, and shameless book plug, second edition of this is out in paperback, and thank you to everyone for your support of the channel. Wouldn't be here without it. Wouldn't have the books coming out. Wouldn't have next book's going to be done. Wouldn't be doing anything I'm doing, even probably still being a historian, if it wasn't for your support, judging by the way certain parts of academic funding are going. But here's the thing. We're talking about this. We're not talking about the next 5 years. We're not talking about the next 10 years. We're talking about future strategy. We're talking 20, 50, 100 years. So, here is the thing. 20 years ago, I was a fresh-faced... Actually, no, I really wasn't even fresh-faced at that point. I was 16 years old and I still had a thick beard. I mean, literally, I was shaving twice a day to conform my school standards. It was a nightmare. But, leaving that to one side, did I think 20 years ago I would be A, on my second stand-up poodle, B, doing my presentations, talking about history over a video medium, have a book published? No. I couldn't even predict that, and that's me predicting myself about one person and what my things are going to be like. So when we're talking about strategy over 20, 50, 100 years, technology doesn't really factor. People go, well, we're looking at the technological progression. You have no idea about the technological progression. Sometimes things can work out, sometimes things can change. When we're talking about things like cyber warfare, the methodology we do cyber warfare today and the methodology we're doing cyber warfare in 20 years' time could be incredibly different. Who knows, the microchips in your brain scenario might actually work out. And that's going to change cyber warfare completely. So when we're talking about future strategy, we are not talking about technology. We are not talking about any of the methodologies of actually waging war. We are talking about what are the capabilities you might need? What are the likely operational scenarios? What are the likely strategic scenarios? And even then, we're being vague. The further you go out, the vaguer we're being. In terms of 20 years, we might be discussing specific regions, not specific countries. Because countries can change quickly. Their leadership, their modus operandi can change overnight. Good example. People often forget this, but in the 1930s, starts off with Germany being the Weimar Republic. At that point, Germany doesn't even feature on Britain's risk register. It doesn't even merit a mention. It's ignored. Because it doesn't. It isn't a threat. It isn't anything when it's the Weimar Republic. It's an annoyance in economic levels and diplomatic levels, but it's not a problem. It might be fudging things, still as the Weimar Republic. They might be building things which are highly intriguing. Doesn't matter. They are nothing. The threats that Britain's managing at that time? Japan. Italy. They are the threats. There are other issues as well in the wider empire. Russia, the Soviet Union as it was at that time, is an issue. Germany doesn't even feature. That changes in less than a decade. And Germany still isn't number one on the risk register up until really mid-1939. Why? Well, as I've often used the example, in January 1939, the Royal Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy are literally pointing guns at each other from less than 300 meters away from it, at each other. In a harbour in China. Germany's being annoying and they're stomping around Europe and they're causing all sorts of troubles, but they are not pointing guns and having guns pointed at them. So, no. Once we're in a 20-year scenario, you're not talking about countries, you're talking about regions. Is this a region prone to stability? Do we have stability or instability? Do we have interests there? That sort of thing. Okay, so when you're talking about strategy, you're talking about how best we maintain a suitable footprint in that region. That's sort of 20 years. 50 years, we're looking at what sort of capabilities in terms of equipment we're going to need. People talk about the Tempest program and a lot of fighter development and ship development. And honestly, you're looking at something which is probably going to be about 20 years on and off in development, and then is going to be serving for 20 to 30 years. So you're looking at something over a 50-year period. If you start a program off in terms of ship development now, you might go, well, yes, these ships will actually be in the water in 10 years' time. Well, I can guarantee you parts of that program have been going for 10 years already. There will be things, foundational things will all have been underway. If you haven't got that ongoing research, if you haven't got that ongoing stuff, you end up in issues. You end up in a lot of issues. Before you even know the design of what ship you're building, you have to start thinking around things like what sort of infrastructure you need in place to build what you're likely going to need. That's a part of the concept. They are now rebuilding Glasgow, the dockyard in Glasgow, which is building the Type 26 project. That's huge. Are they doing that for the Type 26 program or for the Type 83 program, though? That should be your first question. Because they've already built HMS Glasgow in Glasgow using the existing infrastructure. So why are they building the next generation of infrastructure, and why is that included in the Type 26 program? Oh. It's probably for next program. That's why you have an ongoing building construction. And again, this is another thing, you have to start thinking about an ongoing building structure, because if you as a country can maintain an ongoing flow of construction, those ships are going to be a lot cheaper to build. Those programs are going to be a lot cheaper to build. Why? Because you're not going to have skill degradation and have to be doing skill rebuilding. And every time you have to do that and go through that cycle, it gets more and more expensive. It does. So when we start looking out over the next 20, 50, 100 years, you have to first make your judgment of, do you expect the world to be as peaceful, well, rather, get more peaceful, about as peaceful, or less peaceful over that time frame? That's the first question you have to ask. How peaceful do you think the world is going to be? Also, then you have to ask the question has the world ever been peaceful? One of the big problems we had coming out of the 1980s and the 1990s and the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, or rather the end of that Cold War, is that the idea was, well, that's going to make the world more peaceful. That was based on the assumption that the bipolar world that we'd been in, because of the threat, had been less peaceful, and less naturally peaceful than things normally are. Whereas actually, if they'd done some proper thinking back, and a few authors and a few writers at the time did, looking back into the multipolar world that had existed before World War II, before the sort of start of the Cold War, and that world had not been peaceful. There had been tons and tons of wars going on. They'd been needing to redeploy forces all over the place. Usually they were smaller forces, but they were still being deployed around here, there, everywhere to deal with problems, deal with issues. Then there was, of course, the obsession with there being a unipolar world. That was the assumption. The assumption was, well, that history's ended. America's going to be the dominant, unchallenged dominant power forever. And so that is going to be the foundation of our security construction, and the way we build ships. And we're only going to have to deal with terrorism and those things. Again, that's not founded in a lot of history. And you can understand it because, again, people want to believe they are right. They want to believe they're better than the generations that have gone before. They want to believe that they know more, that they are more, that they think more, that they feel more. They want to believe these things. They need to believe these things in some ways to justify their current worldview. The trouble is, the world is not so nice. The world is not so restartable. It's not so fresh. And honestly, the first thing you realized with going from a bipolar world to a unipolar world is that not everyone made the transition to become part of that structure of the unipolar world. Also, you may soon realize that some of the countries involved in it weren't, whilst not necessarily seeking to challenge directly the power of the United States, were not going to leave them the unchallenged supreme power of the world. They were going to make them work for it. And the third thing you realized is that not everyone was prepared to work for it, to maintain it. You could have theoretically maintained, well, at least NATO and the West as a combined sort of unitary. Well, how do I put this? Around America would have been the unipolar power, but with NATO and the West nations, including Australia and places like that as well, and that grouping, maintaining a sort of infrastructure around them as well, they could have continued it. But that would have required investment. And it's only if you'd done that investment that you could have possibly managed certain threats and avoided them. But the thing is, those threats weren't perceived because history had ended. This has led to some interesting discussions over the last few years in terms of when we start talking about future strategy. In that you have a complete re-evaluation has gone on. And again, I point out that when I'm looking at the future, there is nothing for me to grasp when I'm going to the future. There is lots of information I can select to base my future from, but I can't grasp and use it because I don't have any certainties. I can look to the past and go, well, there is some ideas and information in here about how they wanted to prepare for the future. But I can't go, that's a certainty, that's going to happen. I can't do that. That makes it a harder sell when you're talking to a wider government, when you're talking to a wider world, because if you're going to say, right then, we need to maintain a presence in this region. Why? Because this region is prone to instability and we need to maintain relationships within that region so that we can do our best to maintain stability and best to see problems coming and head them off before they become major problems. It's always easier to deal with something when it's a minor problem than when it's become a major problem. When people are aggrieved rather than when people are shooting at each other, it's far easier to get them around a negotiating table. The moment people start shooting, hard lines tend to be drawn and everyone gets very, very, very single-minded. So what form of presence? Well, that's when you start to think. Do you want to engage? How do you engage? Let's say if you go for sometimes the cheapest option in terms of actual money is building a base physically there. But where do you put that base? Do you have, in the case of Britain, a nearby overseas territory you can use, which means you can build a base, but you do not have to worry about being tied to any other country and their needs and their politics? If so, lucky you. However, not many countries have that advantage, and not even Britain doesn't have enough overseas territories anymore to be able to do that. So the question becomes, what sort of level of presence do you want? Do you want to have a base, physical base, in another country? Do you want to be tied to that country's politics? Because this is the thing, if you have bases in other countries, you are tied to their politics. Domestic and foreign, you are tied to their politics. Because if their domestic politics mean that they don't agree with you when you want to use those bases for something, then you don't have access to those bases. It's the other problem which comes with when you're doing contributional technological alliances to procure equipment. When you're doing a multinational procurement of something and development of a project, yes, it spreads out cost. Yes, it has advantages in terms of, yes, it has advantages in terms of technological base to draw from. But it also means that there are multiple powers who might have control of equipment and might be the builders of certain parts that then go, well, no, we don't want you to export this equipment to someone else, or no, we won't give you spare parts or give this part supplies because we don't agree with the action you're undertaking. And please note, before anyone starts making a complaint about the bed being mucky, it's neatly put together and placed by me. But some of you have already seen. This gentleman's down there, and he's been rolling around on things. So, this leads us all into, right then, so presence and all these things are factors. Okay, how do we discuss this? We start discussing constants versus transits. Okay, what are transitory problems, transitory factors which could spring up? What are constants? Constants is physical geography. Physical geography is a constant. It really is. So when we're looking at the world's choke points, they are constants. Now, there are some choke points up there which are lesser or greater. I would argue the Danish Straits, which, by the way, for those who aren't sure, are the ones between Denmark and Sweden, rather than the Denmark Straits, which are the ones between Iceland and Greenland. And, of course, there is also the Danish Strait, which is in Canadian waters. There is fun with this. I would argue, sort of, basically the second one in of the yellows. I would argue that is a constant. I'd also argue the English Channel less so. Why would I say that the Danish Straits are a constant? Because whilst with the English Channel you can theoretically go around the rest of the UK, if you want to get into the waters beyond the Danish Straits, if you want to get into those waters, the Baltic Sea, then you have to go through them. Yes, I know there is a canal. There is the Kiel Canal, and people go, well, we can get through the Kiel Canal. You can do. But that doesn't really make... that means your options are a canal, which is a very, very easy to predict route of what ships will go along, or some straits, which, let's be honest, that's kind of predictable which way the ship's going to go as well from its draft. Slightly more options, but not really many. Not really many. And I definitely agree that if the Turkish Straits are there, the Danish one should be as well. Although I think the only reason they aren't there is because of the effect of the Kiel Canal. It is the Kiel Canal which is the reason they're not. Now, if you notice I keep sometimes go out of focus, it's because I'm currently using a curtain as the back system for my lighting, and sometimes the curtain moves, and that changes the light, which changes the focus, and it just causes the poor autofocus to have a panic attack. So I apologise for that. I will have some play around with some masking tape at some point or something, or just not worry about it for this period. There are some really interesting things with these constants, though, because can we presume for the next 20, 30 years we are still going to be reliant on petroleum, on fossil fuels? I know there are all sorts of agreements, but the odds are yes, the world is still going to be reliant on them to a large extent for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Their section of the global energy market might change. Their utility and use might change. What form they're used in might change, but they're probably still going to be an important, a critically important part of the global economy. So, Straits of Hormuz, Middle East, still going to be important. Still going to matter for the next 5 decades. Will I need to still be moving goods between the Atlantic and the Pacific? Yes. Is it likely, therefore, that I'm still going to want the Panama Canal? Yes. Just look at the impact recently of that being slightly dry and slightly shallow in places. Yeah, that's something we need to carry on working on. Suez Canal. So much trade going backwards and forwards. And yes, people are talking about onshoring and all sorts of things. But the odds are there is going to be a lot of trade still going backwards and forwards. There is going to be a lot of trade going around the world. It has been going around the world for as long as humanity has been. It's a safe bet to presume it's going to carry going on in the world as long as the humanity are here. So, trade, moving backwards and forwards and going through those arteries, that's a constant. Transits. Transitory issues. Transitory issues are the things which might flare up. What might flare up? Well, that's usually human geography factors. So, access to water, believe it or not, whilst it's theoretically a physical geography, is also a human geography factor, because there are various things you can build for access to water. You can build a desalination plant. You then need power for it, and where are you going to get that power? Are you going to get that from solar panels? Are you going to get it from wind? Are you going to get it from nuclear? Are you going to get it by burning fossil fuels? How are you going to get that power? I did see a recent interesting article about a theoretical solar system which was entirely self-powered, using the sun, which is a lovely idea, but then I read on and they said to develop it was going to require several $100 million, I think they were talking about it in American money, to develop, and I just thought, who's going to pay to develop it? Because the people who have the money, the spare money to pay to develop that, are they interested in developing it? And the people who might pay to develop it, who have both the money and the tech base to develop it, if they did, would the other people buy it from them? These are problems. Access to water is a constant in terms of need, but it's also transit because it's something which can be managed. It's a transitory factor. Also transitory are, to an extent, economics. That scares economists when I talk about them. They go, it's a constant. Economics is a constant. Well, yeah. But the thing is, 20 years ago, I was walking around with a Nokia 3310. That was my phone. Smartphones were just beginning. They weren't ubiquitous. They weren't what they are now. So therefore, the complexities of what you need from an economic perspective that are likely to cause conflict change, and can change very rapidly. Lithium is now far more important than it used to be. Lithium mining is far more important than it used to be, but let's be honest, lithium is not the only one. It's the most well-known one. It's the one which people like to shout about. Lithium-ion batteries, and they don't look into the actual contents of... Excuse me. Now we've finished with the poodle, who decided that he was going to copy his papa and cut his own hair. Chewing it is not a good idea. Back to the transits. Things change. So unless you are sure about what resources specifically and where those resources are going to be needed for the next 20, 30 years, 50 years, you can't really necessarily prep a long way in advance. You can't do that. And now he's gone off for his dinner. So, these things change. Steel, probably still going to be needing that. Let's be honest. As much as we might like to talk about new materials, steel pretty much is ubiquitous. Aluminium, fairly constant need. So yeah, when we're talking about transits and constants, we are talking about access to resources. And again, quite often people put the guarantee is in the open market. It's in the open market. That's where you get your guarantee. In a free and open market. The trouble is, the world never actually runs on a free and open market. Good example, during the Cold War, when the Americans needed to buy a load of titanium, they had to buy it from the Soviet Union, because they were the only ones who were mining titanium and getting enough of the resources out to mine it. And this was needed for the SR-71s. Did they just go up and buy them? No, they had to hide the fact they were buying it. They set up multiple dummy corporations, multiple dummy companies, and they procured it in smaller amounts. It was a major CIA and many other of the alphabet organizations' project. There are societies, there are countries around the world which are less open, which are less prepared to trade. And that's before we get on the fact of, even if you're open and happy to trade, if you need that resources, who are you going to prioritize? Who will you prioritize? Your own nation or others? It's very easy while you have enough and no one's short of resources and everything's going well to say, of course we wouldn't do that. Of course we'd be open. Of course we'd still be part of the world. It's very easy to be good in the good times. It's not so easy in the hard times. And again, the thing about when you're preparing future strategy and you're talking about it is it's a conversation, and you do have to consider what you'd like to do in the hard times. And this might mean that you are like Britain in the 1920s and 30s, where you just keep adding up, keep increasing the strategic fuel reserves to the point at which you have an obscene amount of ship's fuel. Literally, they have it stored all around the world. They have huge amounts of fuel stored. Why? Threat of conflict and the desire to not be reliant upon supply, matching demand. The idea of having your own supply, your own store, so that, frankly, if the supply doesn't keep up with your demand, it doesn't matter. You have enough to see you through. Not just a couple of months, but years of war. That was the entire point of the British in terms of ship's fuel. One of the big problems for the British was that in terms of aviation fuel, there hadn't been a time to build up an equivalent store. Or rather, the Air Ministry had, in a piece of strategic thinking worthy of a certain colonial secretary from the era of the American Revolution, Lord George Germain, had decided that, well, the Royal Navy insists on maintaining a reserve, but we won't need to, because as long as the Royal Navy has a reserve, they will ensure our access to the fuel. That, please note, before someone starts worrying about, they did build up. Yes, they did, but they started a lot later. The Royal Navy had been building it up prior to World War I, just carried on building and kept building bigger and bigger and more stores and supplies from 1920s and 30s. The Royal Air Force starts off under Trenchard with a very different worldview than they generate under later commanders. But broadly speaking, you have your constant versus your transits, and constants, broadly speaking, are things like physical geography. Transits are everything else. Broadly speaking. So you have to physically think, right then, If I have interests in this area, how do I best have a presence there? If I have interest there, and do you choose to have a presence? It depends again on your national size and your level of interest and your level of economic exposure, because you might go, well, it's better if I just have an ally who has an interest in there. And they'll have a presence there and I rely on them. In which case you need to maintain very good relationships with that ally. If you are going to make your thing entirely reliant upon an ally, an alliance, you need to make sure you're indispensable to that alliance. I'd argue a good example of this is the Franco-British alliance and the Anglo-Franco alliance in the run-up to World War II, really. Why are the French building the capital ships they're building? Why do they build the Dunkirks? Why are they looking at the Recollets? Well, one of the reasons is they want to provide the Royal Navy with things it is short of. It's short of fast capital ships at the time. Its battle fleet is mostly 23, 24 knots. It's got a few vessels which are faster. Renown, Repulse, Hood. And it's building faster, the King George V's, but they all take time to come into service. So what it's short of is vessels for its fast wing. So you're prepared to accept, let's build a fast battleship that carries less guns than we necessarily could put on it, and less firepower than we could put on it, so it has more power in terms of horsepower. How do we justify that? Well, there are various methods of to use to justify it, but basically it's designed to take on the theory is based around taking on a Deutschland class which has been turned into a battleship, i.e. Scharnhorst. Before the Scharnhorst really sort of comes into knowledge and existence, that's what the Dunkirks are built to fight, and the older Italian battleships. It's always good to start saying, well, we're going to do it to deal with the 11-inch guns and defend against the 11-inch guns, definitely the very powerful 11-inch guns of the Deutschland class. The fact is, those are the same guns which are fitted to the Scharnhorst. It makes sense. So I started off with a constant actually being trade. Trade is a constant. There is a constant flow, but as I said, it's not necessarily a free market or a fair market. It's not. There are all sorts of controls on trade. There are all sorts of things being put in there. You've even got the factors of sometimes currency manipulation by countries to make their mines and their resources more profitable for companies to seek to exploit, which will affect the movement of trade and which countries get the investment versus others. This is a pretty old density map, but if anything, it's only gotten worse in terms of the focusing of the density of the routing, not any more spread out. The movement of goods, the movement of trade around the world really does show you the supply and where the supply and demand is. Where things are going, where things are needed. Who has the power to buy. Also shows you, again, which of those choke points really do have an impact. As you can see, the Channel and the Danish Straits, well, they are fairly impactful in terms of the sheer amount of resources going past them. Panama Canal, fairly heavy. Certain parts of the coast around the world are places where you might want to think about concentrating. I do notice how they don't list the Taiwanese Straits, but let's be honest, the area around Taiwan, that's a big amount of trade, with lots of nations being exposed to that. Same with Sri Lanka. There's a trade going around Sri Lanka and the southern tip of India. Strait of Hormuz, of course, where roughly 30% of the world's fuel supplies move through, almost on a daily basis, and 30% of the world's fuel and sort of that's moving. I think the earlier slide has the actual stats written in it. Yeah, 30% of all oil traded on the world's oceans passes through the Straits of Hormuz. Gibraltar, again. Basically, you can consider Bab el-Mandab, Suez, and Gibraltar one giant choke point set on what is the world's busiest motorway of shipping. The amount of trade going through that area is shocker. And so, okay, suddenly Mediterranean becomes interesting, and suddenly the strategic rationale for Britain being quite so, we are very, very supportive of Gibraltar, whatever they decide. Thankfully at the moment that is to stay a British overseas territory because of how various things have happened over the years which have made them slightly more firm on it. Its population have decided they want to stay, and it's the Treaty of Utrecht. So, you know, it's there. That's useful for Britain, because Gibraltar is still a vital strategic position. It has been. It was before the Suez Canal, because it was a gateway to the Mediterranean, and allowed the British to seal off the French Mediterranean fleet and stop them being able to combine with their Atlantic fleet. Because let's be honest, if they can combine their Mediterranean Atlantic fleets, then you have a far bigger problem for Britain to deal with. That was always a strategic rationale. For America, the presence around the world, well, again, how much of American money, American banking, American insurance, American companies owning interests, and American goods are exposed to all that trade? If you're hearing a vibrating noise, I think that is coming from the dryer. I think it's coming from the washing machine and dryer. So I apologize, that's not my computer. That is the washing machine and dryer. I've checked, it is. I was worried it was my computer for a bit, but no. It is the washing machine and dryer. Please note, for this is random things. The reason I was worrying it was the computer was because with the place where it is at the moment, there's a lot more corgi fluff getting to it, corgi glitter, and I'm having to clean it out far more regularly, pretty much daily. So I was worried it was the computer for a bit, but I know. Went and checked. Again though, but this video is illustrating how I can't even really predict what's going to come on in the next 30-40 minutes when I'm recording. Because despite theoretically telling everyone I was going to be recording and could you please hold off on certain things, they decided to be helpful to me because I needed I had my washing pile was ready to be done. It had put it in the washing room ready, so I would do it later. They decided to be helpful and do it, being very nice. It's very kind of them to do it for me. But that's now created the vibration in the background. That's kind of annoying when I'm recording. If you can't predict 30-40 minutes in advance of what people within a very small group are going to do, and completely ignore what you ask them to do, then you can't really predict a world. So how do we prepare a future strategy? We've got constants, we've got transits. How do we prepare if we can't predict things? Well, this is where you get people like Corbett and Cable. I can't find a decent picture of Cable. I can find a decent picture of Corbett. But that's Cable's book. Cable only died in 2001. Not that long ago, 22 years ago. And Corbett, well, he died a little over 100 years ago. You also have Mahan, you have Roosevelt, you have so many others. And the constant you get with all of their works, the constant you get with all of their thinking, is trying to give you guidelines for how to approach problems. One of the problems, though, we have got now is that, especially with the complexity of the system of systems we build into our ships, and what we build into our systems in terms of even our aircraft, they do need to be far more detailed in their planning and their working than perhaps they ever needed to be before. And that takes time. That also takes time to design and time to build and time to prepare. So, whereas in the space of the last 17 years of Julian Corbett's life, the Royal Navy went from HMS Dreadnought, well, basically from the Lord Nelsons, to the Nelson class. Let's be honest, Nelson class battleships would wipe out a pre-Dreadnought fleet without even thinking about it. Or, as I'd like to call them, a Royal Sovereign style battle fleet. If we consider Cable, in his lifetime, the world changed completely. Nuclear weapons came into service. So, what is it that they tell us that is useful? What is it that they tell us that provides us with anything to think about for future? Well, there is a reason why Corbett is called Some Principles of Maritime Strategy. There is a reason why Cable's is called Gunboat Diplomacy. In the nicest way, it's a rather brusque title for actually a very nuanced and subtle book. But pretty much both of them are arguing about how you might employ and use capabilities which they don't even know what they are yet, and why you might employ them, and therefore what you are likely to need available. Not in terms of hard and fast numbers, but if you think this is a likely scenario, you're going to face this risk in this area, this is what likely capabilities you're going to need to employ. I.e., if we consider this, let's just go to the last sentence of the first paragraph here. We say the aim of naval strategy is to get command of the sea. This means something quite different from the military idea of occupying territory, for the sea cannot be the subject of political domination, or dominion or ownership. We cannot subsist upon it, like an army on conquered territory, nor can we exclude neutrals from it. The value of the sea in the political system of the world is as a means of communication between states and parts of states. Therefore, the command of sea means the control of communications, in which the belligerents are adversely concerned. The command of the sea can never be, like the conquest of territory, the ulterior objective of a war, unless it be a purely maritime war, as were approximately our wars with the Dutch in the 17th century. But it may be a primary or immediate object, and even the ulterior object of particular operations. History shows that the actual function of the fleet, except in purely maritime wars, has been threefold: the furtherance or hindrance of military operations ashore, the protection or destruction of commerce, the prevention or securing of alliances, i.e. deterring or persuading neutrals as participating in the war. Sadly enough, this is a constant. So pretty much aircraft carriers and amphibious ships, or anything which exists to strike the enemy ashore and give you a long range strike, is pretty much agreed in number one. So maintaining amphibious capability, maintaining that kind of intervention capability is critical. It's a critical strategic enabler, because it allows you to do those operations. I can guarantee you, in 1962, when they laid down HMS Fearless, no one thought that 20 years later, roughly, because she's laid down in July and the war happens before July, roughly 20 years later, she would be spearheading the invasion, well, the recapture and liberation of the Falkland Islands. No one thought that. But having an amphibious capability, the ability to move troops and do a theatre entry, is useful. It's critical. It enables you to actually do things. So when we're thinking about the future of strategy, we're thinking about what kind of capabilities we are likely to need as a nation. What kind of capabilities in terms of broad terms? Because can I say what ships you're going to need in 50 years for amphibious warfare? Probably not. I have an idea in my head. I have a feeling it's going to be an evolution of an LHD, because you're still going to need to get heavy equipment ashore, and I don't see air power getting any better. And short of someone developing a transporter system that allows you to beam it ashore, you're probably going to need some form of landing craft to do it. And you're probably going to want to have aviation capability, because you're still probably going to have helicopters of some kind, or some form of aircraft that's going to move troops ashore, personnel ashore, and light systems. That's going to be a factor. Do I know what kind of aircraft they're going to fly from? No. They could be Quinjets for all I know. Honestly, they could look like they are out of the Avengers. No idea. Don't really care. There isn't a factor when we're doing this discussion. So, that's a factor. Again, protection or destruction of commerce. Okay, so the ability to do some sort of convoy system, protect or destroy it. So submarines. Submarines also fall at hindrance in military operations ashore if they can, fire appropriate missiles. But destruction of commerce. Submarines are great for that. Protection, not so good. But you're looking at escort forces, and that means a lot of cheap and cheerful escorts. Now again, if I'm looking ahead, I'm looking at going, well, what would be a modern flyer class? It probably wouldn't be crude. I've discussed this in other videos when I've talked about what a future flyer class would look like, what it would look like in terms of... It probably wouldn't be crude. It might be optionally crude, but the odds are you have something like a Type 26 sitting in a formation, acting as the command ship. You might have a secondary command and control facility for aboard one of the merchant vessels and in the convoy, and then you'll have the rest of the vessels wandering around will be uncrewed assets that you will fly out engineers to if they need to be fixed. Okay, what happens if they need to be resupplied and refueled? Well, that's going to be more complicated, but it's not exactly impossible. Again, you might end up with an actual mothership design which again has a dock like an LHD. You could end up with the LHD being the basis of your future naval operations, because it's got a dock large enough for a suitable vessel for sea states to go into, and you can, inside that dock, reload a VLS system. You can change out something like a Standflex system, because again, a Standflex system is a modular system of weaponry. And again, the likelihood for smaller vessels, especially for small vessels which are doing convoy escorts, etc., is you will want to be modular. And if they're uncrewed, a modular Standflex system that you can swap the system off, maintain it aboard your LHD sort of like command ship at the center that sort of operates in the center of your formation, and put in a new system so they can go straight out, that makes sense. That's an actual viable system, which, if you're looking at it, has been discussed in bilge pumps, by the way, as well. The prevention or securing of alliances. Again, this is the presence mission. This is peacetime. This is conflict management and presence and shaping the conflict before it even begins. That's assets. There are a lot of assets involved in that. There's a lot of presence involved in that. There's a lot of tiers to the presence. Capital ships are as much that never visit an area are as much a part of that as ships which actually are the constant presence, and you need ships to be the constant presence. So again, things like OPVs being forward based, they're useful. can be your constant presence in a region, in a low threat region. The higher the threat level, the higher the complications, the more you're going to have to think about what exactly you have there as your presence asset. Swear the draft on that curtain's got worse since they started the washing machine. So it quickly becomes a lot of questions about capabilities. Not a lot of questions about specific designs. It's one of the reasons why I find it funny when people ask me, oh, what's going to be the ship after the Type 83? I have no idea. No idea. I know what its broad spread, and I know what it's going to need to be able to do. It's going to need to be able to do the air defense mission, whatever form that's taking that time. Probably land attack missions. I forget that the L shape has a massive impact on this camera. And it's going to probably need to be able to carry some form of anti-submarine systems. But again, will those systems be crewed aerial assets and crewed deployable vessels? Will they be uncrewed, or will they be optionally crewed? Will it be a mixture of crewed and uncrewed systems, because it might also have the ability to insert small amounts of troops, so therefore you might want it to have a crewed aviation asset. And I am fairly certain that for at least the next 50 or so years, the odds of deploying anything other than very small numbers of elite special forces in non-human piloted systems is very, very low. There is a reason for that. The moment you're putting a human life completely dependent in a war zone on a machine, or even a remote control, remotely operated system, you're going to have to be absolutely certain. And there are some very niche cases where the cost might be justified. The likely cost might be justified. Of what will be essentially a disposable asset as well. Versus the likely cost of building a suitably crewed system, which might have assistance from sort of things. We have no idea. This is before we get into the whole joy of future strategy of cyber warfare, as I've talked a bit of reference about earlier, but, that is going to be a feature in naval systems. The more and more you have uncrewed systems, the more and more you are going to have to make sure they are protected from all sorts of forms of attacks. There's brute force attacks, which could be basically versions of electronic warfare, bombard them with so many signals they don't know what's going on, to perhaps something ultimately more scary, which are teams and teams. And that's the big thing. These countries, especially when they are developing their cyber warfare capabilities, are often deploying entire teams of individuals who have very niche, very specialist skills. And the thing is, where are those people going to be based? Are they going to be on the ships close to the action? Do they need to be on the ships close to the action? Or are they going to be further away? Well, if they can deal with it remotely, fine. But what happens if you're trying to use your laser link from your local command ship to override commands which are trying to be put in by the satellite link, which is somehow the satellite has been compromised? Shouldn't be, but let's say for some reason the satellite link has been compromised. Well, if all the people with the skills are in the other part of the world trying to use the same satellite link, they could be out of luck. But that's rather involved for future strategy, because that's a whole system. That's down quite low. That's a probable capability. We're going to need some form of cyber strike capability. We're going to need some form of cyber defense capability. What form is that going to take? You don't really have any idea. There could be a massive breakthrough in AI. Some really smart person could have a massive breakthrough in AI, and we could have AI-driven firewalls, artificial intelligence. Or alternatively, we might find that our current AI development is a complete dead end, which plateaus for the next 30 years. You don't know. You don't know. That is the problem. And this is more from some principles of maritime strategy. Concentration. The interesting thing is he takes it to an extent from Clausewitz. The best strategy is always to be sufficiently strong at first generally, then at the decisive point. There is therefore no higher or simpler law for strategy than this: keep your forces together. Doesn't mean keeping them all in one concentrated mass, but rather keeping them so dispersed they can unite and readily at will. The thing is with modern weapon systems, again, this is the point about when we're talking about naval warfare. We're talking about task forces. We're talking about ships which are task forces made up of multiple task groups. And task groups made up of multiple units. Each of those units are, if they're an individual ship, are a system of systems. In fact, you can argue almost they're often a system of systems of systems. A system of systems of systems. Get it right. In that, you would be talking about their AS warfare suite, which will have it will be a system, but that will have multiple systems within it. And that is one part of the ship. Their air defense system will be a suite, which has multiple systems in it, which might well have multiple systems below them. Once you're dealing with interfacing with various different types of missiles and guns, and the whole thing is multiple layers of technology. And all these have to work together. How do we make them work together? Well, here's where something comes through in terms of strategy. And I'm going to use a completely different area to demonstrate it. What is the highest indicator of survivability and injury factor in policing? It's level of training. How often they can go on courses, how often they can receive refresher training, how often they can have that all renewed, have that time to take a step back from what they're doing to evaluate it and evaluate themselves and improve themselves. It's the same with armed forces. Train hard, fight easy. It's been a matter. Let your wars be bloody drills, your drills bloodless wars. Or battles be bloody drills, your drills bloodless battles. Those phrases have been around for a very, very long time. Those who seek peace must first prepare for war. They haven't survived thousands of years because people are egotistical or don't like rewriting history so that they're cleverer than the people behind them. No, it's because those lessons have been learnt in blood time and time again. So, what is a strategic factor here? Well, a strategic indicator of a nation which is going to be capable of looking after itself as a nation which isn't, is one which keeps training. One which keeps exercising. So again, that gives you a budget to watch. That gives you something to watch in terms of things that often get cut. Makes you worry when you see things cut. When to get a next generation technology built in and put in service, which is often something which is very attractive to political classes. There are often cuts made in personnel, which can affect the career progression of the entire force and the maintenance of that force. But also, cuts might be made in training, in terms of training budgets. That's a problem. It affects preparation today, but it also affects preparation tomorrow. How does it affect preparation today? Well, how capable your troops are going to be is probably down to how well trained they are. How much time they've had sitting doing make busy work versus how much time they've had actually drilling, actually carrying out exercises and realistic exercises and throwing themselves at as difficult a scenarios as that you can do. And sometimes that's a problem-solving scenario. One of the really interesting discussions I had with someone recently was whether or not things like, here are 10 logs, some rope, and usually some random items, make a bridge that can take this weight to go across that river. People go, well, that's a waste of time. No, it isn't. It's going to teach teamwork, which is always important for forces, but also it's going to teach them to the skill of taking a step back, looking at a problem, and working out how to fix it. That's a process. And that matters. That's good preparation. So future of strategy. Future strategy, think about the next 50 years. You automatically have to factor in things like, well, how much are we going to devote to training? How are we going to preserve training areas? What kind of training areas do we want to train our personnel in? Are we likely to be exposed to combat in warm climates? In which case, do we need an appropriate training facility? Are we likely to be dealing with armoured warfare needs? Do we therefore need an appropriate training facility? Some would argue that's below the level at which you're talking about, but it really isn't, because it's a key enabler of any future strategy. Have you thought through the training needs of it? We know you're going to need X capabilities. We know you're going to need to be experienced in these sort of environments. Those are the broad stroke things. So we need to maintain those abilities to train in those environments. We need to maintain those capabilities. Do I know what that capability is going to look like in 50 years' time? No, I don't. I want to build that into a ship, but what kind of ship am I going to build? When I've got to the point at which I need to start building it, which is probably about a decade away from it, designing and fine-tuning it, it's going to be about a decade. And then at some point in that decade, I'm going to press the build button. And then 2 to 3 years later, I'm going to have a ship. Goody, I have a ship. It's got loads of new equipment on it and stuff, which is different from the old one. So I'm going to spend the next 2 years learning out how to use it. Yeah, it might be commissioned. I might be able to use it. But it's going to take me a while to work it up and actually be sure about how I'm going to use it, because there's how these things worked on paper and on the design board, and there's how they worked in reality. So again, this is part of me having to think about this strategically. Do I want to gap a capability for 10 years? Well, you can make a very stupid decision, and you can decide in 2010 to gap a capability for a decade, and then you can find very quickly you needed that capability. Ouch. Well, that's bad. That's bad future strategy. That is a good example of bad future strategy. You can say that was made for an economic decision because you could maintain one air fleet or the other air fleet. The trouble is, one of those air fleets is linked to a unique maritime capability, which is rather useful to have, and maintenance of it will make the reintroduction, growth of that capability a lot cheaper, versus the other capability, which isn't. But realistically, you probably needed to maintain both for the relative costs as they were existing assets. But again, that's a strategic debate you need to have when you're talking about future strategy, because you need to be talking about likely risk versus reward. And this is where we get into what is the most annoying area of modern strategic debate. Oh, and I absolutely despise it. I absolutely despise it. That is Defense by Matrix. Strategy by Matrix. It's called many names. Basically, it comes down to the same thing. You're using almost an insurance form table, and if I just shrink this down a bit, despite this is quite a cool image. I know it's lots of images I put together, but I do rather like that slide. Okay? Imagine it, you've sort of decided to draw a level of risk, likely sort of peer exposure, and you've got the capabilities needed to manage it on sort of one graph, and you draw this graph and you go, right then, pick here where you want to be in terms of your level of risk you want to expose the country to, and that tells you what you need to buy. It's very straightforward, Minister. It really, really works. Here is the thing. In theory, that is a great system, but you see, the trouble is, it's not being done by machines, which are going to pick automatically the logical one, as you see on there, and go for a sensible level of risk and a sensible level of procurement. It's always going to be picked by humans who are going to do trade-offs. Who are going to think, well, if we build that, that provides jobs in X or Y constituency. But I don't consider that personally a high risk, because, let's be honest, it's a good example. Through a large chunk of the 1920s and 1930s, Winston Churchill honestly believed, despite the fact the Royal Navy were regularly pointing guns at the Japanese and Japanese were regularly pointing guns at them, he honestly disbelieved that the Japanese would ever go to war with Britain, because it would be absolutely stupid, because the British Empire was so powerful. At the same point, he also argued at several points that it would be absolutely terrible for Britain to go to war with them, because we couldn't possibly lose. We were both at the same point, sometimes in the same debates, he would make the point that we were too powerful for them to go to war with, but also so lacking in power we'd lose a war against them. And usually this was around debates around whether or not we should fund Singapore as a naval base. So the trouble is, once you have this sort of system, it looks great. It's a graph, it's risk analysis, everything sounds so mathematical, and yes, this is which, but the trouble is, it's then implemented by humans. And the thing is, the reason I don't like it is because it takes a lot of the thought and discussion out of the debate. And that is a problem. You need discussion, you need thought, you need these things within a debate, because if you don't have them, if you don't have the full breadth of discussion, if you don't give the things the level of light and inquiring they deserve, you will end up with a fudge that will end up causing you trouble. Because here is the dirty little secret of wars. Right? Even in world wars, ones which last many years, most of the equipment you fight the war with is the equipment you started the war. Yes, we can point to the current conflict in Ukraine. I'm sure someone will pick that one up and go, well, they're not fighting the war with mostly the equipment they started the war. No, but that's a very small, localized war, and lots of major powers have been able to stretch out their equipment and send it off to them. But the trouble is, if those major powers ended up in a war tomorrow, the odds are the equipment they have now is what they're going to fight most of that war with, because it's going to take time to rebuild those stocks. Yes, some nations have far greater stocks than others, and we can argue about the sensibility of that. My view tends to be more on having the equipment is better than not having the equipment. But it costs. It costs money to maintain it. It costs money to repair it. It costs money to keep these things going, and to keep these things relevant. And the trouble is, for major powers, they often want to keep their equipment at the highest level, which is necessary for them because of the likely forms of conflict they could end up in, because there were scenarios of peer-on-peer conflict. And so you can't afford to have anything less than equivalent equipment to go into that combat. But the trouble is, maintaining even your older equipment at peer-on-peer levels is expensive. And you can't afford to have a 2-track equipment network because, or set up, because things will end up inevitably with the lower track having to be called on to fight a war. And defense by matrix is strategy by matrix is just too open to interpretation, too open to manipulation for me and my viewpoint. It presents things as a very simple, this is it, we've picked this point of a level of risk, therefore we get this. You can fudge it too much. You shouldn't be able to, because it's the purity of numbers and everything's given a value. But there are too many human parts of that equation going on in terms of the inputting of the data and assessment of the data that goes into it and the actual application of it. Too much of it happens behind closed doors. Now recently, when I was looking for this, and I was looking for a paper I wrote about that subject, about matrix, which was actually never published, sadly enough, because, well, it didn't work out that way. I was searching through my email list and all sort of these discussion points of emails and going, oh, what's appeared in there, what's there, what's in that, and I found a reference to Hansard debate from 1953 on aircraft carriers. And it really seemed to come home to me because you have people like Viscount Trenchard, Lord Chatfield, Lord Freyberg, Lord Henderson, not the Admiral Henderson I talk about, who was Third Sea Lord prior to World War II. He, unfortunately, had died. This is another gentleman. Lord Winster, Viscount Mersey, engaged in this massive, long debate, this full thing in Hansard. And if you want to go look it up, if you go to the Hansard website and look at April the 15th, 1953, you will find, under defence, you will find a long debate in the House of Lords. And what I find amazing is that after World War II, less than 8 years after World War II, there is an actual debate going on about whether or not aircraft carriers are useful still. And the debate being used, the facts being used, is the range of aircraft. Aircraft now faster, longer range than ever before. Do you need an aircraft carrier? Remember, this is going to be a debate which features on until the 1960s and is going to be part of the reason for the whole getting rid of carriers, then, no, that actually doesn't work, and bringing in the Invincible class scenario. Because, they can provide, air defense can be provided from shore. The trouble is, yes, an aircraft can reach that range, so on stats and the maths, it works. But how long can it be at that range for, and where does it go once it's used up its weapons? It has to fly all the way home. And how many aircraft are you therefore going to have to maintain a constant patrol? Because the aircraft, the moment they run out of weapons, have to go home. So you can't predict, and you've got to deal with the timeline of those aircraft coming. So you can't start to really plan it round. You have to almost be launching. Let's say they are 3 hours of flight away from the nearest base. Well, you therefore have to know that you're going to run out of missiles in 3 hours' time. Probably longer than that to prep and launch aircraft, so about 4 hours' time. You're going to have 4 hours warning that you're going to run out of missiles to guarantee you can replace those aircraft on station. Because the moment they've run out of weapons, they have to return home to be rearmed. The thing is, on paper, you can make the case they have the range, they can provide the coverage. But the sheer number of aircraft you're going to need for that role versus having an aircraft carrier is amazingly problematic. But that's going into the full defence debate. And they're having this debate in 1953. Why does this feature in with the defense by matrix? Because defense by matrix is even more numerically based and even therefore more able to be manipulated. Because whilst numbers are pure, and the idea is that numbers don't lie, that maths 2 plus 2 equals 4. True. But what happens if I decide that's not 2, that's 2.1? And that isn't 2, the other 2 isn't 2, no, that's 1.5. Then I've got 3.6. That's different from 4. When you're quantifying risks and you're quantifying the analysis, there are lots of very, very advanced systems that are used to quantify risks. Just ask anyone who's an insurance risk profiler. They will have all sorts of very, very advanced systems they can call upon. But ultimately, it's based on averages. Ultimately, it's based on what people usually do. The trouble is with preparing for war is you need to factor in what people don't normally do. Because let's be honest, at its base point, war is never a sensible decision to make. You decide on war, you shoot yourself in the foot immediately. If you have to go to war, there are problems. And also, ultimately, a lot of time, countries do not decide to go to war. They don't decide whether they're going to fight a war. They end up fighting a war. Whether they like it or not, whether they want to or not. That's it. So, future of strategy. It's a discussion. There is never an answer. It's capabilities, not systems. It's not methodologies, because honestly, these things can change. Future of strategy is working out what kind of capabilities are you going to need. Are you going to need air defense? Are you going to need layered air defense? Yeah. The odds are you are going to, because let's be honest, layered air defense is the best form of system that we've ever developed for doing air defense, where we have an outer air defense system and lots of layers in it, because it's an onion style program to protect the core. And the core is often some of the things that actually provide the outer defense. It's a cute piece of irony, really. Sometimes things exist to protect the other things that protect them, to enable you to actually do the operations. And this is the problem with especially future strategy when it comes to maritime and naval affairs. It's so much about communications. It's not a physical thing you can. We're not going to protect this sea. We're not going to control this sea or own this sea. We're going to command this sea. And command of the sea is, as Julian Corbett put it, it's about your ability to use the sea, not and deny its use to your opponent, not your ability to hold the sea. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed all this. I know without a shadow of doubt that any comments probably are going to get into the debate of various pieces of technology and systems and all those things, because those are, let's be honest, they're the sexy bits. They're the sexy bits of when we're looking at the future, the cool, snazzy bits of technology. Lasers and railguns and Gauss guns and future missiles and hypersonics, all these things, they are the sexy bits. But the reality of it is you need the strategy of what kind of mission and what kind of scenarios are you going to be facing. Are you going to need to do amphibious operations? Yes. The odds are you're going to be deploying some form of ground force. It doesn't matter if that ground force you're deploying is uncrewed. You might be deploying a completely robotic force. Cute. You're still going to need to deploy it. It doesn't matter. So it's broad terms, broad capabilities, training. What kind of scenarios are you going to be training in? Do you think you're going to be fighting in cold climates? Do you think you're going to be fighting in warm climates? Do you think you're going to be in deserts or jungles? Do you think you're going to be in mountains? Do you think you're going to be in valleys? Do you think you're going to be in wet places, dry places? What kind of beaches do you think you're going to be going over? These are things you have to think about years in advance of them actually taking place. Or rather, you have to have the capability, potentially, for years. And you might never use it. But having the ability to use it is often part of your diplomacy. That gunboat diplomacy scenario again. Having the capability but not actually having to use it because you have the capability, so therefore people don't want you to use it. They know you can use it, so therefore they don't do X or Y, because they know you can do something about it. That's, of course, deterrence. And conventional deterrence is just a bigger part of strategy as nuclear deterrence or unconventional deterrence. So, question. If you were going to try to start a defense debate about the future of strategy, about the future of your nation's defense, how would you go about it? How would you do it? How would you start that debate? And how would you get people involved? Because remember, for a defense debate to be effective, it has to include far more than just the people who are interested in defense. Thank you very much for watching. Let's see what else we got coming up. We have got next week, building the fleets of Toshima. That's good. I have got the right book with me now. I picked it up. Yay. And why no more battleships? It's going to be good. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. And what have we got coming up in terms of lives? We've got everything a Scharnhorst. Germany standardizes on one hull for capital ships and carriers. It's going to be interesting, but it can be a bit weird. That one already can be a bit weird. Thank you very much for watching. Take care.